The blizzard hit without warning, burying everything in its path under a relentless torrent of white. Hallie Everett clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, each step more desperate than the last. Behind her lay a trail of blood, but the swirling snow was quickly covering any trace of her passage through the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness of 1878. Hallie had been running for 3 days now, ever since she'd escaped the clutches of Barton Reed, a man who'd bought her from her stepfather for $400 and a prized stallion. The bleeding wound on her shoulder was where Reed's bullet had grazed her during her escape, and though she'd bound it as best she could, the constant movement had reopened it more than once. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her words immediately swallowed by the howling wind. But in truth, Hallie had no destination, no sanctuary waiting. Her only goal was to put as much distance between herself and Reed as possible. The temperature dropped further as twilight approached. Hallie's legs finally gave out, and she collapsed against the trunk of a large pine. The snow felt almost warm after the bitter cold of the air, and a dangerous drowsiness began to creep over her. She knew what this meant. Her grandmother had told stories of men found frozen stiff after falling asleep in winter storms, but her body refused to move. "Just a moment's rest," she murmured, her eyelids growing heavy. "Just a moment." Xavier Lawson pulled his hat lower against the biting wind, cursing himself for not making it back to his cabin before the storm hit. His horse, Buck, trudged reluctantly through the accumulating snow, clearly sharing his master's sentiment about being caught out in such weather. "Come on, boy," Xavier encouraged, patting the horse's neck. "Just over this ridge and we'll be home." As they crested the hill, something caught Xavier's eye, a dark shape against the white landscape, partially covered by snow. Narrowing his eyes against the driving snow, he guided Buck closer. "What in tarnation?" he muttered as the shape resolved into the form of a woman, nearly buried in snow, slumped against a tree. For a moment, he thought she was dead, another unfortunate soul claimed by the unforgiving frontier. Then he saw the faintest cloud of breath in the frigid air. Xavier dismounted quickly, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he rushed to her side. She was young, maybe 20 or so, with dark hair that had escaped from beneath a threadbare bonnet. Her face was pale as the snow itself, lips tinged blue from cold. Miss, can you hear me?" Xavier tapped her cheek gently, then with more force when she didn't respond. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes of a startling golden brown that reminded him of autumn leaves. "Don't," she whispered, trying weakly to push his hands away. "Please." "I ain't going to hurt you," Xavier assured her, noticing for the first time the dark stain on her shoulder. "You're bleeding." He glanced around, assessing their situation. The storm was worsening by the minute, and nightfall was imminent. His cabin was still a half-hour ride away, but this woman wouldn't last that long without shelter. "I need to get you somewhere warm," he said firmly, moving to lift her. She struggled against him with what little strength she had left. "Who are you?" named Xavier Lawson. "I've got a place not far from here. You'll freeze to death if you stay out in this." A flash of fear crossed her face. "I can't, he'll find me." Xavier didn't know who he was, but he understood the look in her eyes. He'd seen it before in the faces of people who'd been hunted. "What's your name?" he asked as he carefully lifted her into his arms. She hesitated, clutching at consciousness. "Hallie," she finally whispered. "Hallie Everett." Xavier looked at the rapidly accumulating snow, already covering the faint tracks she'd left. By morning, there would be no evidence she'd ever passed this way. Snow buried her trail and name, the cowboy said. "Your name's safe with me, now move." He settled her onto Buck, then mounted behind her, supporting her limp form against his chest. As they set off toward his cabin, Xavier couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble this woman was in, and whether he'd just invited that trouble into his home. The journey to Xavier's cabin seemed endless. Hallie drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the strong arms holding her upright, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, and the relentless cold seeping through her sodden clothes. When they finally arrived, Xavier dismounted first, then carefully lifted Hallie down. She tried to stand, but her legs crumpled beneath her. Without a word, he scooped her up again and carried her to the cabin door, the interior of Xavier's home was simple but welcoming. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small kitchen area opposite. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center, while a bed was tucked into one corner. A wooden trunk and bookshelf completed the sparse furnishings. "Let me get a fire going," Xavier said, setting her gently on the edge of the bed. Hallie nodded weakly, too exhausted to speak. Xavier moved with practiced efficiency, coaxing the banked embers in the fireplace back to life and adding kindling until flames licked eagerly at the larger logs he fed them. The growing warmth began to penetrate Hallie's frozen limbs, bringing with it an almost unbearable pain as sensation returned. "I need to see to your wound," Xavier said, turning back to her, "and you need dry clothes." Hallie clutched her shawl tighter, sudden panic giving her strength. "No." Xavier raised his hands placatingly. "I don't mean any disrespect, miss, but that shoulder needs tending and those wet clothes will kill you sure as any bullet." "I can manage myself," Hallie insisted, though she could barely keep herself upright. Xavier studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll turn my back. There's a shirt of mine on the hook there you can use. Once you're decent, I'll look at that shoulder." True to his word, Xavier turned away, busying himself with hanging a kettle of water over the fire. Hallie struggled with the sodden laces of her dress, her fingers stiff and clumsy from cold. After several frustrating attempts, she realized the impossibility of her task. I need help," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Xavier approached cautiously, keeping his eyes respectfully averted as much as possible while helping her with the fastenings of her dress. When the garment finally loosened, he quickly turned away again, allowing her privacy to slip out of the wet clothing and into his shirt. The shirt was enormous on her slender frame, falling nearly to her knees, but it was dry and carried a comforting scent of pine and leather that was uniquely his. "You can look now," she said softly. Xavier turned, medical supplies in hand, and gestured to the chair by the fire. "Sit there where I can see better." As he cleaned and bandaged her wound, Hallie studied him surreptitiously. He was not what she'd expected from a frontier man. His touch was gentle, his movements careful. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes the deep blue of a summer sky. His hair, what she could see beneath his hat, was a rich chestnut brown. "This is a bullet wound," Xavier observed, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Hallie tensed. "Yes, recent too, 3 days ago." Xavier finished bandaging her shoulder in silence, then moved to the kettle, which had begun to steam. "Tea will help warm you from the inside," he said, measuring dried leaves into a pot. Hallie watched him, uncertainty warring with gratitude. She'd learned the hard way that men rarely offered help without expecting something in return, yet Xavier had saved her life, tended her wound, and asked for nothing. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. Xavier looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "What kind of man would I be if I left you to die in the snow? Most men I've known wouldn't have troubled themselves," she replied honestly. A shadow crossed his face. "Then you've known the wrong sort of men, Miss Everett." The use of her name startled her, reminding her of the danger she was still in. "About my name, I shouldn't have told you. If anyone comes asking, no one came through here," Xavier interrupted, setting a steaming cup before her. "I haven't seen a soul in days." "That's the truth I'll tell anyone who asks." Hallie wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it for far more than just the tea. Xavier nodded, a slight smile softening his features. "You should rest. Take the bed. I'll bunk down by the fire." She wanted to protest, but exhaustion was pulling her under with irresistible force. The last thing Hallie remembered before sleep claimed her was Xavier draping a warm blanket over her and murmuring, "You're safe now, Hallie, I promise." When Hallie awoke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single window. For a moment, she lay disoriented, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, her collapse in the snow, Xavier finding her, bringing her to his cabin. Pushing herself up, she winced at the pain in her shoulder. The cabin was empty, but a fire crackled in the hearth and she could smell coffee brewing. On the table was a plate covered with a cloth, and beside it a note scrawled in a surprisingly neat hand, "Gone to tend the horses." food on table. Rest. Hallie rose cautiously, relieved to find her legs steadier than they'd been the previous night. She padded to the table and lifted the cloth to find biscuits, still warm, and a small pot of honey. Her stomach growled, reminding her it had been days since she'd eaten properly. After devouring the biscuits and pouring herself a cup of coffee, Hallie explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was neat and well-maintained, not what she'd expected from a bachelor's dwelling. The bookshelf held a surprising array of volumes Milton, Shakespeare, Thoreau, and several scientific texts on agriculture and animal husbandry. A man of education then, not just a simple rancher, her dress and undergarments had been hung near the fire to dry. Though still damp in places, they were wearable. Hallie dressed quickly, wincing as she worked her injured arm through the sleeve. She'd just finished pinning her hair when the door opened. Xavier stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. He carried a bucket of milk in one hand and a basket of eggs in the other. Seeing her up and dressed, he smiled. "Morning. How's the shoulder?" "Better, thank you," Hallie replied, suddenly awkward in the daylight. The food was delicious. Xavier set his burdens on the kitchen counter. "Glad you ate. You need your strength." He hung his coat on a peg and turned to face her. "Storm's passed, but there's near 2 feet of snow out there, trails impassable for a few days at least." Hallie's heart sank. She couldn't stay here the longer she remained in one place, the greater the chance Reed would find her. "I should go," she said, moving toward the door. "I've imposed enough." Xavier stepped between her and the door. "Miss Everett, you wouldn't make it a mile in this snow. Besides, that shoulder needs proper healing." "You don't understand," Hallie insisted. "It's not safe for me to stay here. It's not safe for you either." "This is about whoever shot you," Xavier guessed. "You're running from someone." Hallie looked away, unable to meet his piercing gaze. "Yes." Xavier was silent for a long moment. "I reckon you've got your reasons," he finally said. "And I'm not one to pry into another's business, but fact is, you're not well enough to travel, and even if you were, the snow makes it impossible right now. So how about we come to an arrangement?" Hallie looked up warily. "What kind of arrangement?" "You stay here until you're healed and the snow melts enough for safe travel. In return, you help with what chores you can manage. I could use the company and you could use the rest." It was a reasonable proposal, yet Hallie hesitated. The last time a man had offered her shelter, it had ended with her being sold like cattle. Seeing her uncertainty, Xavier added softly, "I gave you my word last night, Hallie. You're safe here. No one will harm you under my roof, least of all me." There was something in his eyes, a steadfast honesty that she'd rarely encountered. Against her better judgment, Hallie found herself nodding, "All right, until the snow melts." Xavier smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Good. Now, how about some breakfast that isn't just biscuits? I make a fair hand at flapjacks." As the days passed, Hallie and Xavier settled into an easy routine. Her shoulder healed rapidly under his careful attention, and as her strength returned, she insisted on taking on more household duties. Xavier taught her to cook on the wood stove, a skill she'd never properly learned in her father's house, where servants had handled such tasks before his death, and her mother's remarriage had thrust them into poverty. They spent the evenings by the fire, Xavier reading aloud from his books while Hallie mended his clothes or worked on the quilt she'd started making from scraps of fabric he'd had stored away. She learned that he'd come west from Boston 5 years earlier, purchasing this small ranch with an inheritance from his grandfather. He raised horses primarily, with a few cattle and chickens for his own sustenance. Xavier, in turn, discovered that Hallie had a quick mind and a dry wit that emerged as she grew more comfortable in his presence. She had a talent for mimicry that left him laughing until his sides ached, and a gentle way with animals that impressed even him, who'd worked with horses all his adult life. What Xavier didn't learn was anything about Hallie's past, or the circumstances that had led to her flight through a blizzard with a bullet wound in her shoulder. Whenever the conversation veered in that direction, she would grow quiet, her eyes taking on a haunted look that made him change the subject quickly. On the 7th day, as they sat at breakfast, Xavier finally broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Snow's starting to melt," he observed casually. "Trail should be clear in another day or two." Hallie's hand stilled, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Yes, I noticed. You still planning to leave? She set the cup down carefully. I have to. Why? The question was gentle but insistent. Hallie looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Because if I stay, I put you in danger, and after everything you've done for me, I couldn't bear that. Xavier leaned forward, his eyes serious. Hallie, I'm not a man who scares easily. Whatever trouble you're in, perhaps I can help. You've helped enough, she replied, shaking her head. More than enough. At least tell me who's after you. Who shot you? Hallie was silent for so long that Xavier thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. His name is Barton Reed. He bought me from my stepfather. Xavier's face darkened with anger. Bought you, like property? Hallie nodded, unable to meet his eyes. After my mother died last year, my stepfather saw no reason to keep me around. Reed offered him $400 and a stallion. Her voice turned bitter. Apparently that was a fair price for a stepdaughter he never wanted. That's illegal, Xavier said, his voice tight with controlled fury. A humorless laugh escaped her. The law doesn't concern men like Reed. He has the sheriff in his pocket, along with half the county officials. He owns the largest ranch in the territory and employs more men than any other outfit. No one crosses him. You did, Xavier observed softly. Hallie's eyes flashed. I wasn't going to be his possession. He has 3 other women at his ranch already. They're like ghosts, hollow-eyed and broken. I swore I wouldn't end up like them, so you ran. I waited until he got drunk one night, took his horse and a pistol. I was nearly to the next county when his men caught up to me. There was a fight. Reed shot me, but I managed to get away in the confusion. She touched her shoulder unconsciously. I've been running ever since. Xavier was silent, processing what she'd told him. Finally, he asked, Where were you headed? Denver, she replied. My father had a friend there, a lawyer. I thought perhaps he could help me. That's still your plan, Hallie nodded. What else can I do? Reed won't stop looking for me, not after I humiliated him by escaping. He's a proud man, and I've made him a laughingstock among his peers. Xavier stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. You can't travel alone. It's too dangerous, especially with Reed's men searching for you. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do, Xavier said firmly, turning to face her. I'll take you to Denver. Hallie stared at him, astonished. What? No, I can't ask that of you. You didn't ask, I offered. Your ranch will still be here when I return. My neighbor's son can look after the stock for a few weeks. He's been wanting to earn extra money. Hallie shook her head in disbelief. Why would you do this? You hardly know me. Xavier came back to the table, sitting down across from her. I know enough, Hallie Everett. I know you're brave and stubborn and too proud for your own good sometimes. I know you have a kind heart, even after all you've been through. And I know that I can't stand the thought of you facing this danger alone. There was something in his voice, in the intensity of his gaze, that made Hallie's heart beat faster. It's a long journey, she said weakly. All the more reason not to make it alone, he countered with a small smile. Reed's men will be watching the main trails. Then we'll take the less traveled routes. I know this country better than they do. Hallie searched for another objection, but found her resistance crumbling in the face of his determination. And if she were honest with herself, the prospect of facing the journey alone had terrified her. All right, she finally agreed, but I'll pay you back somehow when we reach Denver. Xavier's smile widened. We'll figure something out. Now let's start planning our route. As Xavier spread out a map on the table, Hallie felt a curious mixture of apprehension and relief. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time since she'd fled Reed's ranch, she wouldn't be facing that danger alone. The next 2 days were a flurry of preparation. Xavier rode to his neighbor's farm to arrange for the care of his livestock, returning with supplies for their journey. He was careful to give no hint of their destination, merely stating that he had business that would take him away for a few weeks. Hallie packed provisions, sewed an extra set of clothing for herself from fabric Xavier provided, and helped prepare trail food that would sustain them for days. She was grateful for the activity, which kept her mind from dwelling too much on the dangers ahead. On the morning of their departure, Xavier presented her with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "What's this?" she asked, unwrapping it to find men's clothing, trousers, a shirt, vest, and a hat. Disguise, Xavier explained. A man and woman traveling together will draw notice. A couple of cowboys won't, Hallie nodded, understanding the logic. Clever. Can you ride astride? He asked. Yes, my father taught me before he died, though my stepfather considered it unladylike and forbade it after. Xavier smiled. Good. There's a stream a few miles south where you can change. We'll cut cross-country from there, avoiding the main trails. They set out just after dawn, Hallie riding Xavier's second horse, a gentle mare named Sadie. The snow had indeed melted considerably, though patches remained in shaded areas. The air was crisp and clear, with a hint of the spring that was still weeks away. As promised, they stopped at a stream where Hallie changed into her disguise behind a stand of trees. The clothes were loose but serviceable once she'd cinched the trousers with a piece of rope. She tucked her long hair up under the hat, then rejoined Xavier. He gave a low whistle of approval. Not bad. Keep your head down and don't speak when others are around, and you'll pass for a young ranch hand. They traveled steadily through the day, Xavier leading them on a meandering route that avoided settlements and well-traveled paths. By nightfall, they'd covered nearly 20 miles, putting significant distance between themselves and the ranch. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, building a small fire for warmth but keeping it low to avoid detection. As they sat eating a simple supper of beans and jerky, Hallie looked up to find Xavier watching her with an unreadable expression. What is it? She asked. Just thinking how different you look in those clothes, almost like another person entirely. Hallie glanced down at herself and chuckled. I must look ridiculous. Not at all, Xavier said softly. You look free. The word struck Hallie with unexpected force, free. Wasn't that what she'd been seeking all along? Not just escape from Reed, but true freedom to determine her own path. I suppose I am, in a way, she said thoughtfully. For the first time in years, I'm making my own choices, even if those choices involve running for my life. Xavier prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. What will you do in Denver, after you see your father's friend, I mean? Hallie had asked herself the same question many times. Find work, I suppose. I'm educated enough to be a teacher, perhaps, or a clerk in a shop. No family to return to, she shook her head. None that would welcome me. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father. They were wealthy Charleston aristocracy, and he was a nobody with grand ideas. His family is all out east, and I've never met them. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's not easy being alone in the world. Is that why you came west? Because you were alone? A shadow crossed his face. Partly. My parents died when I was 21, influenza. After that, Boston held too many memories. I'd always been drawn to the idea of the frontier anyway, open spaces, room to breathe, chance to build something of my own. And have you? Built something of your own, I mean. Xavier was quiet for a moment. Started to. The ranch is coming along. But a home needs more than just walls and a roof. There was something wistful in his voice that made Hallie wonder if he was lonely out here, despite his independence. Before she could pursue the thought, Xavier rose to his feet. We should get some sleep. Dawn comes early and we've got a long day ahead tomorrow. They settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, the stars spinning overhead in the vast Wyoming sky. As Hallie drifted toward sleep, she found herself thinking of Xavier's words. A home needs more than just walls and a roof. It had been so long since she'd had a real home, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. Their journey continued steadily over the next several days, each dawn finding them a little closer to Denver and a little further from Barton Reed. They avoided towns and settlements, camping under the stars and subsisting on their trail rations supplemented by game Xavier hunted along the way. On the 5th day, they encountered their first real obstacle. As they approached a river crossing, Xavier raised his hand for a halt. Something's not right, he murmured, scanning the far bank with narrowed eyes. Hallie followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. What is it? Not sure, just a feeling. Xavier had learned to trust his instincts during his years on the frontier. Let's wait and watch for a spell. They withdrew to a stand of cottonwoods overlooking the crossing. For nearly an hour they observed in silence. Just as Hallie was beginning to think Xavier's caution was excessive, movement on the opposite bank caught her attention. Two riders emerged from the trees, leading their horses to the water's edge. Even at this distance, Hallie recognized them immediately. Reed's men, Tom Decker and Frank Holly's. Her blood ran cold. "Those are Reed's men," she whispered, shrinking back instinctively. Xavier's expression hardened. "Looks like they're watching the crossing. Probably have men stationed at all the major river points." "What do we do?" Xavier studied the terrain thoughtfully. "We'll head upriver a few miles, find another place to cross. It'll add a day to our journey, but better safe than sorry." They retreated quietly, careful not to draw attention. For the rest of the day, they traveled parallel to the river, keeping to cover whenever possible. By nightfall, they'd found an alternative crossing point where the river narrowed and rocks provided a natural ford. They made a cold camp that night, not daring to light a fire so close to Reed's men. As they huddled under their blankets, the temperature dropping rapidly with the setting sun, Hallie couldn't stop shivering. "Here," Xavier said, moving closer and wrapping his own blanket around her shoulders as well. "Body heat's the best way to stay warm." Hallie stiffened initially at his proximity, then gradually relaxed as the warmth of his body began to seep into hers. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything. I'd likely be dead by now if not for you." In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression, but she felt him shake his head. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Hallie Everett. You'd have found a way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the river's murmur and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Can I ask you something?" Hallie ventured finally. "Of course. Why did you really decide to help me, not just taking me in that night, but this journey to Denver?" "It's a huge risk, and you had no obligation." Xavier was quiet for so long that Hallie thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was soft but certain. "My mother used to say that a man's character is defined by the choices he makes when no one's watching. When I found you in that snow, I had a choice: leave you and continue on my way, or help you and accept whatever complications came with that decision." He shifted slightly, his arm brushing against hers. "There was only one choice I could live with." "Most men wouldn't see it that way," Hallie observed. "Then most men are fools," Xavier replied simply. Hallie turned to look at him, his profile barely visible in the starlight. There was a steadfastness to Xavier Lawson that she'd never encountered before, a moral certainty that didn't waver in the face of difficulty or danger. It was as attractive to her as his physical appearance, perhaps even more so. "We should try to sleep," Xavier said, breaking the moment. "We'll cross at first light." They crossed the river successfully the next morning, the cold water numbing their feet despite their boots. On the far bank, Xavier insisted they continue riding in the river for nearly a mile before emerging, to obscure their trail in case Reed's men came searching. By midday, they'd put considerable distance between themselves and the crossing, and Xavier deemed it safe enough to stop for a brief rest. As they shared jerky and hardtack in the shade of a rocky outcropping, Hallie noticed Xavier repeatedly scanning their backtrail. "Do you think they're following us?" she asked. Xavier shook his head. "No sign of it, but Reed's not a man to give up easily from what you've told me." "No," Hallie agreed grimly. "He's not." "Tell me more about him," Xavier requested. "The more I know, the better prepared we'll be." Hallie sighed, the memories still raw. "Barton Reed came to our town about 2 years ago, bought the biggest ranch in the county, and immediately set about expanding it. He's ruthless in business, drove several smaller ranchers off their land through various means, not all of them legal." "And your stepfather, how did he come to sell you to Reed?" Hallie's expression darkened. "After my mother died, Harold, my stepfather, took to drinking heavily. He was never a kind man, but grief and whiskey made him cruel. He gambled away most of what little we had left when Reed expressed interest in me. Harold saw an opportunity." "Did Reed force you before you escaped?" Xavier's voice was carefully neutral, but Hallie could sense the tension beneath. "No," she said quietly. "He wanted to break me first, make me accept my place, as he put it." The other women at his ranch, they'd all been through the same process. Isolation, intimidation, occasional physical abuse, but never that, not until they were completely submissive. Xavier's jaw clenched. "He sounds like a monster." "He is," Hallie confirmed. A charming one, which makes him all the more dangerous. In public, he's the very model of a gentleman. No one would believe the things that happen on his ranch. They finished their meal in somber silence, then resumed their journey. For the next several days, they traveled without incident, gradually moving from the high plains into more mountainous terrain as they approached Colorado territory. On the 8th day of their journey, they reached a small settlement nestled in a valley. Their supplies were running low, and Xavier decided they needed to risk a visit to the general store. "Stay close, keep your head down, and let me do the talking," he instructed as they approached the cluster of buildings that comprised the town. Hallie adjusted her hat lower over her eyes and hunched her shoulders, trying to appear as masculine as possible. The settlement was little more than a trading post, a saloon, and a few scattered dwellings, but after days in the wilderness, it seemed bustling with activity. Xavier tied their horses at the hitching rail outside the general store and gestured for Hallie to follow him inside. The store was dim after the bright sunshine, and it took a moment for their eyes to adjust. An elderly man stood behind the counter, while two customers browsed the shelves. "Afternoon," Xavier greeted the storekeeper. "Need to resupply for the trail, coffee, flour, beans, bacon if you've got it." The old man nodded and began gathering the items. "Heading where, if you don't mind my asking?" "South," Xavier replied vaguely. "Got work waiting." The storekeeper nodded, not pressing further. As he wrapped their purchases, the door opened behind them, admitting a gust of cold air and two men. Hallie kept her back turned, but something about their voices set her nerves on edge, said she might have headed this way. "Woman traveling alone, dark hair, pretty thing according to the boss." Hallie froze. Reed's men. She didn't dare turn to look, but she could feel Xavier tensing beside her. "Haven't seen any woman like that," the storekeeper was saying. "Not many ladies pass through here alone." "Well, if you do, there's $20 for information that leads to finding her. Mr. Reed is mighty concerned about his niece's safety, traveling all alone like she is." Hallie nearly choked at the audacity of the lie. Xavier placed a steadying hand on her arm, his grip warning her to remain calm. "That's mighty generous," the storekeeper remarked. "Must be quite concerned about the young lady." "Oh, he is," one of the men replied with a chuckle that made Hallie's skin crawl. "Right worried he is." Xavier finished paying for their supplies, keeping his hat pulled low. "Much obliged," he said to the storekeeper, his voice deliberately gruff. "Come on, boy," he added to Hallie, giving her a gentle push toward the door. They had to pass directly by Reed's men to exit. Hallie kept her head down, heart pounding so loudly she was sure they must hear it. One of the men glanced at them, then looked away, clearly not recognizing Hallie in her disguise. Once outside, they mounted their horses and rode casually out of town, resisting the urge to gallop away at full speed. Only when the settlement was well behind them did Xavier finally speak. "They're casting a wide net," he observed grimly. Hallie nodded, still shaken by the close call. "Reed has the resources to keep searching for months, and that lie about me being his niece clever makes him look like a concerned relative rather than a man pursuing his property." Xavier's face darkened at her choice of words. "You're not property, Hallie, no matter what Reed thinks." "I know," she said softly, "but in his mind that's exactly what I am, something he paid for, something that belongs to him." "Well, he's wrong," Xavier stated flatly, "and we're going to make sure he never gets near you again." They pushed on harder after that, traveling longer hours and taking even greater precautions. Xavier led them on increasingly remote trails, sometimes backtracking or traveling in circles to confuse any potential pursuers. They avoided settlements entirely, even when their supplies ran low. 3 days after their encounter in the town, they crossed into Colorado territory. The landscape changed, becoming more rugged and mountainous. Xavier seemed to know these trails as well, navigating with confidence through passes and valleys that saw little traffic. How much further to Denver? Hallie asked one evening as they made camp in a sheltered canyon. 4, maybe 5 days if the weather holds, Xavier replied, glancing at the sky. Spring storms can be unpredictable in these mountains. Hallie nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Part of her had grown accustomed to this journey with Xavier, to their companionable silences and thoughtful conversations around the campfire. The prospect of reaching Denver meant safety, yes, but also separation. "What will you do?" she asked. "After you've delivered me safely to Denver." Xavier poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "Head back to the ranch, I suppose. Spring calving will be starting soon." "It seems inadequate to just say thank you," Hallie said, meeting his gaze across the flames, "for all you've done." Xavier smiled, the firelight casting his features in warm gold. "I didn't do it for thanks, Hallie." "Why did you do it then?" she pressed, needing to hear the answer. Xavier was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because from the moment I found you in that snow, something changed. I couldn't have left you then, and I can't leave you now, not until I know you're safe." There was more in his words than simple concern, Hallie was certain of it. She'd seen it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, felt it in the careful way he helped her mount her horse each morning, the protective way he positioned himself between her and any potential danger. "And after I'm safe?" she asked softly. Xavier's expression grew serious. "That depends on what you want, Hallie. What if I don't know what I want?" "Then you take the time to figure it out," he said simply. "Without pressure, without fear, that's what freedom means." Hallie nodded, oddly comforted by his answer. Xavier wasn't demanding anything from her, wasn't trying to stake a claim the way Reed had. He was offering her something far more precious, the space to make her own choices. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words didn't feel inadequate at all. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost rimming the edges of their blankets. They broke camp efficiently, having established a routine over their days of travel together. Xavier saddled the horses while Hallie prepared a quick breakfast of coffee and the last of their biscuits. As they rode out of the canyon, Hallie felt lighter somehow, as if her conversation with Xavier the previous night had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. For the first time since fleeing Reed's ranch, she allowed herself to think beyond mere survival, to consider what kind of life she might build in Denver. They made good progress through the morning, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The air was crisp and thin at this elevation, carrying the scent of resin and melting snow. By midday, they'd reached a high ridge that offered a spectacular view of the mountains beyond. "Beautiful country," Xavier remarked as they paused to rest the horses. Hallie nodded, breathing deeply of the clean mountain air. "I never imagined such places existed. My life before was so confined." Xavier smiled, watching her face as she took in the panorama before them. "The West has a way of expanding your horizons, doesn't it?" "Yes," she agreed. "In more ways than one." They continued on, the trail beginning a gradual descent into a broad valley. Xavier led them off the main path after a while, following what appeared to be a game trail through dense forest. "Shortcut," he explained when Hallie questioned the route. "Cuts half a day off our journey." The trail was challenging, forcing them to dismount in places and lead the horses through particularly rough sections. By late afternoon, they'd reached the valley floor where a rushing stream provided a perfect campsite. Xavier unsaddled the horses while Hallie gathered wood for a fire. As she bent to pick up a fallen branch, a twig snapped somewhere behind her. She straightened, suddenly alert. "Xavier," she called, thinking he might have followed her. There was no response, just the rustle of leaves in the light breeze and the gurgle of the nearby stream. Hallie told herself it was nothing, a deer, perhaps, or some other forest creature, but a prickle of unease ran down her spine. She hurried back to camp, arms full of firewood. "I think there might be someone out there," she said in a low voice as she deposited the wood beside Xavier. He straightened immediately, hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Where?" "In the trees, maybe 100 yards that way," she said, gesturing with her chin. "I heard a twig snap." Xavier nodded, his expression serious. "Stay here. Keep your pistol ready, but don't fire unless you have no choice. Could just be travelers like us." He moved off silently, disappearing into the trees in the direction Hallie had indicated. She drew her own pistol, the one Xavier had given her early in their journey, and positioned herself where she could watch both the trees and their horses. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet now, as if holding its breath. Hallie strained her ears for any sound of Xavier's return. A pistol shot shattered the silence, the report echoing through the trees. Hallie jumped to her feet, heart hammering against her ribs. Another shot followed, then a third. "Xavier," she called, starting toward the sound. Before she'd gone 10 steps, Xavier burst from the trees, running hard. "Mount up," he shouted. "Reed's men." Hallie didn't waste time with questions. She ran to Sadie, hauling herself into the saddle as Xavier reached his own horse. They spurred their mounts away from the camp just as two riders emerged from the forest behind them. "Ride," Xavier urged, leading the way along the stream bank. They galloped through the gathering dusk, the thunder of hooves drowning out all other sounds. Hallie bent low over Sadie's neck, giving the mare her head. Behind them, Reed's men pursued doggedly, slowly closing the distance. Xavier veered suddenly away from the stream, directing his horse up a steep incline that led back into the forest. Hallie followed, trusting his knowledge of the terrain. The dense trees would make it harder for their pursuers to track them, especially as darkness fell. They rode hard for what seemed like hours, zigging and zagging through the forest, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. Only when Xavier was certain they'd lost their pursuers did he finally call a halt in a small clearing ringed by massive pines. "Are you all right?" he asked, dismounting stiffly. Hallie nodded, too winded to speak. She slid from Sadie's back on legs that trembled with exhaustion and residual fear. "How did they find us?" she finally managed to ask. Xavier shook his head, his expression grim. "Not sure, might have been tracking us since that town, or they could have just been searching these trails and gotten lucky. Will they keep looking?" "Probably," Xavier admitted. "But it's dark now, and we've covered our trail well. By morning, we'll be long gone." They made a cold camp that night, not daring to risk a fire that might give away their position. Huddled beneath their blankets, with only jerky and water for supper, Hallie found herself trembling not just from cold but from delayed shock. Xavier noticed and moved closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's all right," he murmured. "We're safe for now." Hallie leaned into his warmth, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your life." Xavier's arm tightened around her. "Don't apologize. None of this is your fault, Hallie. The blame lies entirely with Reed and men like him who think they can own other human beings." They sat in silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the sigh of wind through pine boughs. "Xavier," Hallie said finally, her voice small in the darkness, "what if they find us again? What if Reed never stops looking?" Xavier turned to face her, his features barely visible in the starlight filtering through the trees. "Then we'll keep running, together." "I can't ask that of you," she protested. "You didn't ask," he reminded her gently. "I offered, and I meant it, Hallie. Whatever happens, you don't have to face it alone anymore." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings that had been building since that first night in Xavier's cabin. Hallie felt it like a physical thing, this connection that had grown from gratitude to friendship to something deeper and more complex. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Xavier remained perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. "Hallie," he whispered, her name a question and a caution all at once. "I never thought I'd trust a man again," she said softly. "After Reed, after my stepfather. I thought that part of me was broken forever, but you've shown me that not all men are like them, that there's still goodness in the world." Xavier caught her hand in his, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm that sent shivers cascading through her body. "There's goodness in you, Hallie Everett, more than you know." Hallie moved closer, drawn by a force she couldn't name. When their lips met, it was like coming home to a place she'd never been, strange and familiar all at once, terrifying and absolutely right. Xavier kissed her with exquisite gentleness, as if she were made of something precious and fragile. His hands remained respectfully at her waist, making no demands, taking nothing she didn't freely offer. When they finally parted, Hallie felt as though something fundamental had changed within her, a door opened that she'd thought forever sealed. "We should try to sleep," Xavier said softly. "Tomorrow will be a hard day's ride." Hallie nodded, settling back against him as he wrapped the blankets more securely around them both. As she drifted toward sleep, Hallie realized that for the first time in years, she was thinking about the future with hope rather than fear. They broke camp before dawn, moving silently through the forest as the first light of day began to filter through the trees. Xavier set a grueling pace, pushing their horses to the limits of endurance as they continued south toward Denver. By midday, there was still no sign of pursuit, but Xavier remained vigilant, constantly checking their back trail and choosing routes that would be difficult to follow. They stopped only briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold meal of jerky and dried fruit. How much farther to Denver? Hallie asked as they remounted. 3 days, maybe less if we push hard, Xavier replied, scanning the horizon with worried eyes. But we can't keep this pace up indefinitely. The horses need proper rest, and so do we. Hallie nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. Already her body ached from the long hours in the saddle, and beneath her, Sadie moved with the heavy steps of a tired horse. "What about that?" she asked, pointing to a plume of smoke rising in the distance. "A ranch, maybe, or a way station," Xavier studied the smoke thoughtfully. "Could be. Might be worth the risk to get a proper night's sleep under a roof. We've put enough distance between us and Reed's men." They altered their course toward the smoke. As they drew closer, the source revealed itself to be a small ranch nestled against the foothills. A modest house, barn, and several outbuildings comprised the homestead, with fields beyond where cattle grazed. "Let me do the talking," Xavier said as they approached. "You're still my young ranch hand." They rode into the yard where a man in his 50s was splitting wood. He paused in his task, leaning on his axe as he watched them approach. "Afternoon," Xavier called, raising a hand in greeting. The man nodded cautiously. "Afternoon, something I can help you with?" "Looking for a place to rest our horses and ourselves for the night," Xavier explained. "Happy to pay for the trouble or work for our keep." The rancher studied them for a moment, his weathered face giving nothing away. "Where you headed?" "Denver," Xavier replied simply. The man seemed to consider this, then nodded. "Could use some help repairing fence on the south pasture." "My son's laid up with a broken leg and I'm behind on chores." "We'd be obliged," Xavier said, dismounting. "Name's Xavier Lawson. This is Harry," he gestured to Hallie, who nodded without speaking. "Samuel Cooper," the rancher introduced himself. "Stables over there." "Get your horses settled, then come to the house. Wife'll have supper ready soon." The Coopers proved to be hospitable hosts. Mrs. Cooper, a plump, cheerful woman, served a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread. Their son, James, sat with his splinted leg propped on a stool, eager for news from the trail. The family asked few questions about Xavier and Harry, seeming to understand the value of privacy in frontier life. After supper, Xavier and Hallie were shown to the barn, where fresh hay had been laid for their bedrolls. Mrs. Cooper had provided clean blankets as well, a luxury after so many nights on the hard ground. "Nice folks," Xavier observed as they settled in for the night, their conversation kept low to avoid being overheard. "Yes," Hallie agreed, glancing around the clean, well-maintained barn. "They've built a good life here." "Is that what you want?" Xavier asked. "A ranch like this someday?" Hallie considered the question. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. For so long, my only goal was escape. But yes, I think I'd like a place of my own someday, land, a home." She paused, then added softly, "Someone to share it with." In the dim light of the lantern, she saw Xavier smile. "That's a good dream, Hallie. What about you?" she asked. "Is your ranch everything you hoped for?" Xavier was quiet for a moment. "It's a start, but like I said before, a home needs more than just walls and a roof." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. After a while, Xavier extinguished the lantern, and darkness settled around them like a comfortable blanket. "Good night, Hallie," he murmured. "Good night," she replied, her mind still turning over his words as she drifted toward sleep. True to their agreement, Xavier and Hallie spent the next morning helping Samuel Cooper repair fencing on his south pasture. The work was hard but satisfying, and by noon they had completed more than Cooper had expected. "You two make a good team," the rancher observed as they paused for the midday meal Mrs. Cooper had packed for them. "Sure I can't convince you to stay on a while longer. Could use the help." Xavier smiled but shook his head. Appreciate the offer, but we need to get to Denver, business waiting. Cooper nodded, not pressing further. Well, you've more than earned your keep, and you're welcome back anytime. They departed the Cooper ranch after lunch, their spirits lifted by the brief respite and the kindness of the family. The horses, too, seemed refreshed after a night in a proper stable with good feed. The trail to Denver took them through increasingly settled country. Small homesteads dotted the landscape, and they occasionally passed other travelers on the road. Each encounter made Hallie tense, though she maintained her disguise as Harry and let Xavier handle any necessary conversation. By the evening of the second day after leaving the Coopers, the distant lights of Denver were visible on the horizon. They made camp for the last time, knowing they would reach the city by midday tomorrow. As they sat by the fire, a strange melancholy settled over Hallie. Tomorrow she would find her father's friend, seek his legal help against Reed, and begin building a new life. And Xavier would return to his ranch in Wyoming, their paths diverging after these intense weeks together. "You're quiet tonight," Xavier observed, pouring her a cup of coffee. Hallie accepted the cup with a small smile. "Just thinking about tomorrow." "Nervous?" "Yes," she admitted. "But not about Reed, or whether my father's friend will help me. I'm nervous about—" She hesitated, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions inside her. "About what comes after," Xavier finished for her. She nodded, meeting his gaze across the fire. "These past weeks have been dangerous, exhausting, terrifying at times, but they've also been." She searched for the right word. "Real," Xavier supplied softly. "Yes, real, more real than anything in my life before, and now it's ending and I don't know what comes next." Xavier set his coffee aside and moved to sit beside her. "It doesn't have to end, Hallie, not if you don't want it to." Hallie's heart quickened at his words, at the intensity in his blue eyes. "What are you saying, Xavier?" He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm saying that when this is over, when you're safe and Reed is no longer a threat, I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." "Court me," Hallie repeated, a smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. Xavier chuckled, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "I know it sounds old-fashioned, but that's what I want to do. I want to take you to dinner and dances and church socials. I want to sit on a porch swing with you and watch the sunset. I want to do all the things we couldn't do because we were running for our lives." Hallie felt a warmth blooming in her chest, a happiness so acute it was almost painful. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." Xavier's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Hallie met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that held both promise and passion. When they parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember this. You're not alone anymore, Hallie Everett, not ever again." In that moment, with the fire crackling beside them and the stars wheeling overhead, Hallie believed him with her whole heart. They rode into Denver the following day, the sprawling frontier city a shock after weeks in the wilderness. Streets teemed with wagons, riders, and pedestrians, while brick and wooden buildings crowded together in a haphazard maze. The noise and bustle were overwhelming after the quiet of the trail. Xavier led them to a modest hotel on a side street, away from the main thoroughfares. "Wait here," he told Hallie, helping her dismount. "I'll get us rooms." Hallie nodded, still maintaining her disguise as they stood in the busy street. When Xavier returned, he led her and the horses around to a stable behind the hotel. "2 rooms adjoining," he explained as they unsaddled the horses. "And I asked about your father's friend Judge William Harrington, correct?" "Yes," Hallie confirmed, surprised. "How did you know his name? You mentioned it when you were feverish that first night at my cabin," Xavier explained. "The clerk says the judge has a law office 3 blocks from here, on Lawrence Street." Once their horses were settled, Xavier escorted Hallie to her room through a back entrance, minimizing the chance of being seen. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking an alley. "Get cleaned up and changed," Xavier suggested. "I'll do the same, then we can go see the judge." Hallie nodded, suddenly nervous now that they'd reached their destination. "What if he doesn't remember my father, or doesn't want to help?" Xavier squeezed her hand reassuringly. "One step at a time, Hallie. Let's meet him first, then decide our next move." An hour later, having bathed and changed into the dress Xavier had purchased from the hotel proprietor's wife, Hallie felt like herself again for the first time in weeks. She'd washed her hair and pinned it up in a simple style, and though the dress was plain, it fit well enough and was certainly more appropriate than men's clothing for calling on a judge. Xavier, too, had transformed himself. Clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, and dressed in a fresh shirt and vest, he looked more like a prosperous rancher than the trail-worn cowboy of recent days. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she opened the door between their rooms. Hallie flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "And you look very handsome, Mr. Lawson." He offered his arm with a smile. "Shall we, Miss Everett?" They walked the 3 blocks to Judge Harrington's office, Hallie growing increasingly anxious with each step. This man represented her best hope for legal protection against Reed, but he was a stranger to her, known only through her father's occasional mentions. The law office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building, its entrance marked by a discreet brass plaque. Xavier squeezed her hand encouragingly before knocking on the door. A young clerk admitted them to a small waiting area and took their names. Moments later, he returned and escorted them into an inner office where a distinguished man in his 60s rose from behind a large desk. "Miss Everett." "I'm Judge William Harrington." He extended a hand, his keen eyes studying her face. "You mentioned your father in your request to see me. May I ask his name?" "Dr. Jonathan Everett," Hallie replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Of Charleston, South Carolina." "You attended law school together at Harvard." Recognition dawned in the judge's eyes. "Jonathan Everett, yes, of course. Brilliant mind, kind heart. We corresponded for years after graduation." His expression softened. "I was deeply saddened to hear of his passing some years ago." "You must be his daughter, Helen," Hallie, she corrected gently. "And yes, I am." Judge Harrington gestured to the chairs before his desk. "Please sit down, and you, sir, are?" "Xavier Lawson," Xavier introduced himself. "A friend of Miss Everett's." The judge nodded, resuming his own seat. "Now, what brings Jonathan's daughter all the way to Denver? Your note mentioned urgent legal assistance." Taking a deep breath, Hallie began to tell her story: her father's death, her mother's remarriage to Harold Winters, her mother's subsequent death, and finally, the terrible transaction that had placed her in Barton Reed's power. She explained her escape, the bullet wound, Xavier finding her in the snow, and their journey to Denver with Reed's men in pursuit. Throughout her narrative, the judge's expression grew increasingly grave. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, fingers steepled before him. "What Mr. Reed and your stepfather did was illegal, Miss Everett," he finally said. "Slavery was abolished in this country more than a decade ago. What you describe amounts to human trafficking, a serious federal offense." Hope sparked in Hallie's chest. "Then you can help me." "I can and I will," Judge Harrington said firmly. "I'll draft legal papers immediately, a restraining order against Reed, and documents asserting your legal independence. I'll also write to the federal marshal about investigating Reed's arrangement with your stepfather and his treatment of the other women at his ranch." "Will that be enough to stop him?" Xavier asked, concern evident in his voice. The judge sighed. "Legally, yes. Practically, men like Reed often consider themselves above the law, but having legal documentation will give you protection, especially in a city like Denver where Reed has less influence than in his home territory." "Thank you, Judge Harrington," Hallie said sincerely. "I can't tell you what this means to me." "Your father was a dear friend, Miss Everett. Helping you is the least I can do to honor his memory." The judge's expression softened. "Now, do you have accommodations here in Denver, funds to support yourself?" Hallie hesitated. "We have rooms at a hotel for now. As for funds." She glanced at Xavier, embarrassed. He had paid for everything since rescuing her, and her own resources were non-existent. "You'll stay with us," Judge Harrington declared, brooking no argument. "My wife would never forgive me if I allowed Jonathan's daughter to struggle when we have plenty of room. And I believe I can help you find suitable employment as well. A friend runs a ladies' academy that is seeking a teacher of literature and music." That's very generous, Hallie began, but the judge waved away her thanks. It's settled then. Come to dinner tonight, both of you, and we'll discuss the details. 7 o'clock. He wrote his address on a card and handed it to Hallie. My clerk will have those legal documents ready by then as well. As they left the judge's office, Hallie felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since her escape, she could see a path forward that didn't involve constant fear and flight. That went well, Xavier observed as they walked back toward their hotel. Hallie nodded, clutching the judge's card like a talisman. Better than I dared hope, but she hesitated, glancing up at him. But, Xavier prompted, what happens now, with us I mean. Xavier guided her to a small park where they could speak more privately. Sitting beside her on a bench beneath a budding oak tree, he took her hands in his. That depends on what you want, Hallie. The judge has offered you a place to stay, possible employment. You could build a good life here in Denver. And you'll return to your ranch, she said softly. Xavier nodded, his expression serious. I have responsibilities there, yes, but Wyoming isn't so very far from Colorado. It's not exactly next door either, Hallie pointed out. No, Xavier agreed with a small smile. But a man determined to court a lady properly would find a way to make the journey regularly. Hallie's heart lifted at his words. You still want to court me then? More than ever, Xavier affirmed, his blue eyes intent on hers. These past weeks have shown me what kind of woman you are, Hallie Everett. Brave, resilient, kind, and stronger than you know. I'd be a fool not to want to be part of your life in whatever way you'll allow. Hallie felt tears prick her eyes at his declaration. And if I said I wanted more than just courtship? That I've seen enough of the world to know my own mind and heart, Xavier's expression grew tender. Then I'd say we should give ourselves time to be sure. You've been through a terrible ordeal, Hallie. I don't want you to make decisions in the aftermath of fear and danger that you might regret later. His consideration, his willingness to wait rather than press his advantage, only confirmed what Hallie already knew in her heart. This was a man unlike any she'd encountered before, a man of honor, compassion, and profound decency. 3 months, she said suddenly. Xavier raised an eyebrow. 3 months, give me 3 months to establish myself here in Denver. To heal, to find my footing, to be sure of my own mind, as you put it. Come back then, and if we both still feel the same way. She trailed off, suddenly shy. If we both still feel the same way, then what? Xavier prompted gently. Hallie met his gaze steadily. Then I'll marry you, Xavier Lawson, if you'll have me. Xavier's face broke into a smile so radiant it nearly took her breath away. 3 months it is then. I'll come back on July 15th, and if you haven't changed your mind. He lifted her hand to his lips. I'll be the happiest man in the Colorado Territory. The judge and his wife welcomed them warmly that evening, their spacious home a haven of civilization after weeks on the trail. Mrs. Harrington, upon learning Hallie was her husband's old friend's daughter, embraced her as if they were long-lost family. By the end of the evening, it was settled. Hallie would move into the Harringtons' guest room the following day, and the judge had already arranged an interview for her at the Ladies' Academy. Xavier stayed in Denver for 3 more days, helping Hallie settle into her new situation and ensuring the legal protections Judge Harrington had arranged were firmly in place. They spent those days exploring the city together, enjoying simple pleasures like restaurant meals and theater performances that had been impossible during their flight from Reed. On the morning of Xavier's departure, Hallie accompanied him to the stables where their horses had been boarded. Sadie would remain in Denver with Hallie, a gift from Xavier that she had protested but ultimately accepted. 3 months, Xavier reminded her as he prepared to mount. July 15th, I'll be waiting, Hallie promised, fighting back tears. After everything they'd been through together, this separation felt almost unbearable. Even knowing it was temporary, Xavier pulled her close, uncaring of who might see them in the busy stable yard. Be safe, Hallie Everett. And remember what I told you that night by the fire. You're not alone anymore, not ever again. Their kiss was bittersweet, a promise and a temporary farewell all at once. Then Xavier was mounting his horse, tipping his hat to her one last time and riding away toward Wyoming. The 3 months that followed were a time of healing and growth for Hallie. The Harringtons proved to be the family she'd lost, supportive but never intrusive. The judge's influence ensured that when one of Reed's men was spotted in Denver asking questions about her, he was promptly arrested and held for questioning about the illegal activities at Reed's ranch. Hallie secured the teaching position at Mrs. Potter's Academy for Young Ladies, where her education and natural affinity for music made her an immediate favorite among the students. For the first time in years, she was financially independent, earning her own way in the world. She and Xavier exchanged letters regularly, his arriving by stagecoach every 2 weeks without fail. He wrote of his ranch, the spring calving season, improvements he was making to the cabin, and always, his anticipation of July 15th. As that date approached, Hallie found herself alternating between excitement and anxiety. She'd meant every word of her proposal to Xavier, but a small part of her feared he might have reconsidered during their separation, or that the reality of her wouldn't match the memory he carried. On the morning of July 15th, Hallie rose early, unable to sleep for nervousness. Xavier had written that he expected to arrive by midday, barring any delays on the trail. She dressed with special care in a new blue dress that Mrs. Harrington had helped her select and arranged her hair in a more sophisticated style than her usual simple knot. "You look lovely, my dear," Mrs. Harrington said approvingly when Hallie came downstairs. "Your young man won't know what hit him." Hallie flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "Do you think he'll come, Mrs. Harrington? What if something delayed him, or he's changed his mind?" the older woman finished gently. "From what you've told me of Mr. Lawson and from the judge's impression of him, he does not strike me as a man who makes promises lightly. He'll be here." Hallie nodded, trying to calm her nerves. She'd arranged to take the day off from the academy and now found herself at loose ends, watching the clock's hands move with excruciating slowness. It was just past 11 when a knock came at the front door. Hallie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as the Harringtons' housekeeper went to answer it. A moment later, Xavier stood in the doorway of the parlor, his hat in his hands, looking somehow both exactly as she remembered and entirely new. He'd had his hair trimmed and wore a new suit, but it was his eyes, those clear blue eyes that had first met hers in a blizzard, that made her breath catch. "Hallie," he said simply, and the sound of her name on his lips dissolved all her doubts in an instant. She crossed the room in a rush, propriety forgotten, as she threw her arms around his neck. Xavier caught her close, his embrace strong and sure, his face buried in her hair. "You came," she whispered, drawing back just enough to see his face. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," he assured her, his smile turning her knees weak. Mrs. Harrington discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone in the parlor. Xavier took Hallie's hands in his expression growing serious. "These 3 months have felt like 3 years," he said. "I've thought of you every day, Hallie, every hour, and I'm more certain now than I was then I love you and I want to spend my life with you." Tears of happiness sprang to Hallie's eyes. "I love you too, Xavier. I've known it since that night in the snow when you said my name was safe with you." Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Then I have a question to ask you, Hallie Everett." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a single diamond set in gold. Dropping to one knee before her, Xavier held it up, his gaze never leaving hers. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Hallie answered without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to kiss her, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, a smile of pure joy lighting his features. "When?" he asked softly. "How soon can you be ready?" Hallie laughed, giddy with happiness. "The school term ends in 2 weeks. Would that be too soon?" "Not soon enough," Xavier replied, kissing her again, "but I'll endure the wait if I must." They were married in the Harringtons' garden on a perfect summer day, with Judge Harrington himself performing the ceremony. Hallie wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Harrington had insisted on gifting her, with flowers in her hair and Xavier's ring on her finger. The journey back to Wyoming was like a dream so different from their desperate flight months before. They traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping at hotels rather than camping, enjoying the spectacular landscape as husband and wife rather than fugitives. When they finally crested the ridge above Xavier's ranch, Hallie gasped in appreciation. The cabin had been expanded, with a new wing added and a proper porch wrapping around the front. Flower beds bloomed alongside the path, and in the distance, horses grazed in green pastures. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," Xavier said, squeezing her hand. As they rode into the yard, Hallie noticed something else new, a sign over the gate that read Evergreen Ranch. "Evergreen?" she asked, raising an eyebrow at her husband. Xavier grinned. "Seemed fitting. Everett and Lawson together, Evergreen." "Do you like it?" "I love it," Hallie said, touched by the gesture. That evening, as they sat on their new porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hallie felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The fear that had driven her for so long was gone, replaced by security and love. "Happy?" Xavier asked, his arm around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible," Hallie replied honestly. Xavier kissed her temple, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "That day in the blizzard when I found you half buried in snow, I had no idea I was finding my future." Hallie leaned against him, savoring his warmth and strength. "And I had no idea that in running for my life, I was actually running toward you, toward this." The story of their meeting became a favorite tale to tell in later years to their children, to friends, to newcomers in the community that grew around Evergreen Ranch. "Snow buried her trail and name," Xavier would say, his eyes finding Hallie's across the room. "And I told her, your name's safe with me." And it always was, through all the years that followed, through the birth of their 3 children, through the growth of their ranch into one of the most prosperous in the territory, through challenges and triumphs and the everyday miracles of a life shared in love. Barton Reed never troubled them again. The federal investigation sparked by Judge Harrington's letters resulted in his arrest and conviction for multiple crimes, freeing the women he had held captive and bringing justice to a man who had considered himself above the law. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Xavier gifted Hallie with a journal bound in soft leather. Inside, he'd written a single line on the first page. "Snow buried her trail and name," the cowboy said. "Your name's safe with me now, move." Below it, Hallie added her own line. And in saving her name, he gave her a new one, and with it, a life beyond her wildest dreams. That night, as they stood on the porch of the home they'd built together, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where once she'd arrived as a bride, Hallie turned to Xavier, the years having etched lines of character into his handsome face but done nothing to dim the love in his blue eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding me in that snow." Xavier smiled, pulling her close. "Best thing I ever did," he replied, "and I'd do it all over again every step of the way just to end up here with you." As the sun set on Evergreen Ranch, Hallie Lawson knew with absolute certainty that the desperate young woman who had collapsed in a Wyoming blizzard all those years ago could never have imagined the joy that awaited her, a joy that began with a cowboy who promised to keep her name safe and ended with a life more wonderful than any dream.